We need to have a very serious and very direct conversation about what just happened on national television, because it cannot be allowed to pass without honest examination. ESPN hosted a panel discussion about the Alyssa Thomas situation involving Caitlin Clark, and what unfolded on that broadcast was not analysis. It was not fair-minded commentary. It was something considerably more troubling, and it deserves to be called exactly what it is. Chiney Ogwumike was on that ESPN panel, and the word she chose to use in describing what happened to Caitlin Clark was embellish.
To me, overall, officiating has been a universal issue this year. And that's not the goal of any league, but this is the reality. And when you think about the imperative to call more fouls, we're seeing the highest scoring season ever in WNBA history. That's largely because they're calling more fouls, right? Games are no longer 2 hours, they're 2.5 hours long. So you're seeing that there's an imperative to call more fouls, but there's still a lack of situational awareness or a lack of control of the game by the refs. You can call fouls, but is it dictating how one game is played from the other? Because you can see one game where one is super physical and one where people are dropping 50. There's been a lack of consistency, and this creates a problem in magnifier matchups. And this is a magnifier matchup when you look back at it. Alyssa Thomas, Caitlin Clark, both dominant players, but Alyssa plays on the edge. I know her. And Caitlin sometimes embellishes at times in certain instances. So when you have a scrum, like you said, there needs to be a hyper-vigilance, but also this created a position where the league is now forced to be reactive. And instead of having a control of not just calling fouls, now the league is reacting and doing something that it rarely does on a non-call and instituting a suspension. And to me, that was unique. But I'll lastly say this, because that largely happened because of the optics. In game flow, if you're watching in game speed, I was watching in game speed, I didn't really notice too much because people hit the ground all the time. But then when narratives are created based off of a freeze frame, that can create a huge problem. And I do think that the league, yes, the league was reacting to the optics of that image.
That was just what Tibbetts was saying, right?
Yeah, like if you walk by me and I'm doing this, but then if you play it faster and you see I was actually doing this, to move my nose, it looked different in freeze frame.
But the bigger picture issue here is that, like, in that situation, if you're watching it in real time, both players who are known to make their issues known got up and kept going.
That was my
and so that's why I have a problem, because if you're looking at the reaction even to this day, it breaks my heart, because players, even in Alyssa Thomas's caliber, whether you think she did it intentionally or not, she's dealing with a heightened level of vitriol right now based off of what this situation created, and that doesn't sit well with me. If the league could really handle this better in real time and figuring out how we want more points, we want more fouls, but how do we keep an eye on these specific matchups so we can avoid the narratives getting out of our control. I hope that happens moving forward in the future.
There is nothing about that situation that lends itself to embellishment as a concept. When physical contact of that nature is directed at a player's throat, the reaction to that contact is not a performance. It is not a calculated decision designed to draw attention or manufacture sympathy. It is a human response to being struck. The suggestion that Clark could have or did embellish what occurred is not a nuanced take. It is a framing designed to redirect the conversation away from the conduct and toward the character of the person who experienced it. That is a specific rhetorical move, and it needs to be identified as such. Chiney Ogwumike should have chosen her words more carefully. She was on national television. She had a responsibility in that moment to engage with the reality of what the person being targeted. This ESPN broadcast was the latest and perhaps most nationally visible example of that pattern.
The W at this junction in time would be better without Caitlin Clark, because she is a bigger distraction than she is an additive. Caitlin Clark has gotten the WNBA over the necessary threshold they needed. Now people are watching. Now we realize, oh, there's talent in the W, talent that's actually even greater than Caitlin Clark. And I'm not just talking about bigs like Asia. I'm talking about the Olivia Miles. I'm talking about the Paige Beckers. Hell, I'm talking about the Kelsey Mitchells. Caitlin got the necessary eyes there. But now that the eyes are there, we don't necessarily need her anymore. Caitlin did what only Caitlin could do, and we don't necessarily need her to do anymore. Thank you, Caitlin. We can take it from here. Now you're saying that the WNBA needs to be cognizant of where they put Caitlin Clark on posters. The WNBA and the officials need to alter the rules for Caitlin Clark. The WNBA and opposing players need to treat Caitlin Clark more gently. Caitlin Clark's coach needs to be cognizant of how she talks to her in public because it's going to look like there's an issue. Unless we can take off our gloves for Caitlin Clark and stop trying to act like she's a messiah, the WNBA could and would be better off without Caitlin Clark, at least without this version of everybody coddling and caressing and catering to Caitlin Clark.
Think about the impossible analysis. That is a predetermined conclusion being retrofitted with whatever evidence is available in the moment. The people making these arguments need to pick a consistent standard and apply it uniformly. Either the contact was serious enough to warrant a suspension, which the league confirmed it was, or it was not. The embellishment framing is incompatible with the disciplinary outcome, and defending it requires ignoring that incompatibility entirely. Now let us move to the officiating dimension of this story, because it extends well beyond the Alyssa Thomas incident and into a pattern of inconsistent rule application that is playing out in full public view and becoming increasingly impossible to explain away. This is not a matter of interpretation or subjective judgment about what constitutes a foul in a physical sport. What is being documented and discussed goes to the fundamental question of whether the referee was present, the behavior was visible, the whistle stayed silent. In the same game or surrounding games, Kayla McBride was documented walking directly toward another player, closing the distance between them while clapping, in a manner that is textbook taunting behavior under the league's own rulebook standards. Again, no technical foul, no stoppage, no consequence. Now ask yourself a straightforward question. If Caitlin Clark had walked toward an opposing player, closing that distance while clapping in her face, what would have happened? What would the immediate broadcast reaction have been? What would the social media cycle have produced? What would the commentary on ESPN and every other platform covering the league have said about her leadership, her professionalism, and her suitability as the face of the sport? We all know the answer. We have seen enough of this pattern to know exactly what would have followed. A technical foul would have been issued immediately. The clip would have circulated for days as evidence of Clark's inability to manage her emotions in high-pressure situations. The narrative machinery that positions any visible frustration from Clark as a character flaw would have activated instantly and loudly. But Paige Beckers can clap in a player's face without a technical foul. Kayla McBride can walk directly toward a player while clapping without a technical foul. And the broadcast commentary treats those moments as ordinary competitive fire rather than conduct worthy of examination. This is the officiating double standard that people are calling out. It is not abstract. It is not based on speculation about what might happen in hypothetical scenarios. It is documented in game footage that exists and can be reviewed. The same behavior is being treated differently depending on who is exhibiting it. That is not competitive basketball. That is selective enforcement. And selective enforcement of officiating standards in a professional league is a structural integrity problem that cannot be explained away as referee discretion or situational judgment. The context surrounding these incidents matters as well. The game in which some of these officiating decisions occurred followed a previous matchup that had ended with a confrontational moment between Dana Bonner and Sophie Cunningham. That prior incident should have put the officiating crew on heightened alert for exactly the kind of conduct that then appeared to go uncalled in the subsequent game. The context was already elevated. The history between these teams and players was already documented and visible. And yet the standard of officiating in that environment produced outcomes that are now being scrutinized publicly because they do not reflect consistent rule application. Let us be precise about what consistency in officiating actually means, because it is the foundational principle that gives any sport its integrity. Consistency does not mean that every player gets the same calls in every situation, regardless of context. It means that the same behavior, exhibited in comparable circumstances, is treated the same way regardless of who is exhibiting it. Clapping in a player's face is clapping in a player's face. Walking toward an opponent while clapping is walking toward an opponent while clapping. The rulebook does not contain exceptions for who is doing the clapping or what their broader profile in the league looks like. When that standard of consistency is not maintained, when the same behavior produces whistles for some players and silence for others, the credibility of the officiating structure collapses. And when the player who receives the stricter standard of officiating happens to be the most commercially significant and publicly visible player in the league, the pattern draws exactly the kind of attention it is currently receiving. People are not inventing this concern. They are observing it in real time and documenting it with footage. That is what gives the conversation its momentum and its legitimacy. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is pattern recognition applied to observable and reviewable evidence. The ESPN panel that discussed the Alyssa Thomas situation had an opportunity to engage with these questions honestly and with the analytical rigor that a national platform should demand. Instead, what the audience received was commentary that introduced a concept of embellishment to describe a player's response to documented physical contact, thereby shifting the frame of the conversation from the conduct of the player who made contact to the credibility of the player who received it. That is a significant failure of sports journalism on a significant platform. And the fact that it happened in the context of a conversation that is already deeply charged with questions about fairness, consistency, and institutional accountability makes it considerably more damaging than an ordinary misjudgment in commentary. Chiney Ogwumike is a former professional player. She understands what physical contact in a basketball game feels like. She understands the difference between incidental contact in competitive play and deliberate physical conduct directed at a specific player. She understands, or should understand, what a fist to the throat represents in terms of intent and impact. The choice to use the word embellish in that context is not a product of analytical confusion. It is a choice. It was made on national television with full awareness of the platform and the audience, and it deserves to be evaluated as a choice rather than excused as an oversight. The broader pattern here is one that the audience watching this league has now observed long enough to recognize clearly. When Caitlin Clark is involved in a controversial incident, whether as a recipient of physical contact, a subject of questionable officiating, or a participant in the competitive intensity of a high-profile game, the commentary consistently finds ways to introduce doubt about her experience or her response, rather than evaluating the conduct of those directing behavior toward her. When other players exhibit taunting behavior in the same games where Clark is being scrutinized, the officiating does not respond with the same consistency. When national television platforms discuss incidents involving Clark, the framing tends toward protecting the league's comfort rather than pursuing the honest, analytical question of whether she is being treated fairly by both the officials on the floor and the commentators in the studio. All of it is visible, all of it is documented, all of it is being watched by an audience that is large enough and engaged enough to sustain this conversation regardless of what the league or its media partners would prefer. And the people in positions of authority and influence, the commissioner who has not engaged with these questions with adequate directness, the media figures who have chosen framing over honesty, the officiating apparatus that is applying standards inconsistently in full public view, all of them are going to have to reckon with the fact that the audience is not going anywhere. The scrutiny is not going to diminish. The documentation of these incidents is not going to stop. The word embellish does not describe what happened to Caitlin Clark. It describes what Chiney Ogwumike chose to do with the truth on national television. And that distinction is worth every bit of the attention it is now receiving. The league has a consistency problem. The media has a framing problem, and together, those two problems are producing a credibility crisis that continues to deepen with every missed technical foul, every inadequate suspension, and every broadcast that prioritizes comfort over clarity. The audience sees it, they are calling it out, and they are not going to stop.